This is Pod Strangely Warmed, a place where we tell the good Methodist story, where we have conversations that invite followers of Jesus to seek after that loving, just, and free world that God imagines for us all, and have a little fun along the way. In this season on the podcast, we are encountering two of my favorite things, Jesus and barbecue. And no, we're not really talking about brisket. We're talking about a big bag of questions. And to help us on this journey, we've got a great friend, Reverend Dave Brower from Central UMC, to help us as we explore this big bag of questions.
Thanks, Daniel. If I were to add a third favorite to that, it would be skepticism. And I think one of the most important things we can do as a church is to wrestle with the questions of faith that people are asking inside and outside the church, because that's how we grow in our faith. That's how we grow to understand ourselves and Jesus' work a little bit more. So I'm excited to be here for this journey.
As we explore this series, the questions we're going to wrestle with are, what is the place of doubt and deconstruction in the work of the church? What is the place of politics in the space of faith communities? How do we understand a good God and yet human suffering and evil in our world? And if God is so good, why are Christians jerks sometimes? We hope you will be with us this entire time. For Jesus, barbecue, and a little skepticism. Welcome to Pod Strangely Warmed. I'm Daniel Hawkins, and today, as we explore the big bag of questions, we are beginning with the place of evil, suffering, and death in our life and in the world. With the question, if God is so good, why is there so much evil, suffering, and death in the world? As we explore this, we're in the week leading up to Halloween and All Saints. This is going to drop on Halloween Day, the day before All Saints Day, a time in which loss of life and death is so real and vivid for many of us. It's interesting, the question of evil, suffering, and death is one that God's people have been wrestling with for thousands upon thousands of years, right? For as long as there have been humans, there have been people asking why, right? And for many of those years, we've had lots of deep, thoughtful questions, but we've also had lots of kind of initially flippant responses, right? As we begin this, we're going to get into a lot of deep things here. And first, I want to begin by welcoming Joy Dister-Dominguez, the pastor of Caring Ministries at Keller United Methodist Church. We are so thankful that you are here. Dave, you continue to be alongside us. We are in the afternoon barbecue fog. We have just had really good barbecue in the midst of this. And so, Joy, we're just going to count on you to carry this, okay? As we wrestle with this, as we hear this question, a question that's echoed through the ages, what are some kind of responses that you have heard over the years that either rang hollow for you or you found acceptance with first, but then kind of upon reflection wrestled with, I really don't know if I can hold on to that. I understand where people are coming from, but I have a hard time, holding that to be true, as you guys have wrestled with this question of evil, suffering, and death.
Yeah, I think throughout my life, I can recall times of suffering and grief and sadness. And people would say to me, well, everything happens for a reason. And as you begin to explore that question, it's really hollow and it doesn't make sense, because the answer to that is not of God. If you think of suffering and evil and sadness and grief, that's incongruent with who God is. I believe that God is love, God is good. And so it's incongruent, which makes it really an empty saying that almost can explain away the difficulties in life, the suffering, the pain in life that we all experience. And that's really not an appropriate question to ponder, about this theodicy, right? That it's meant to happen this way and God intended this bad thing to happen. And it can really cause great harm having those beliefs.
Yeah, I've heard other people in other traditions rely really heavily on the sovereignty of God. Well, God is sovereign, so God can do what God wants to do. Sure. So you don't really have room to question it, because who are you to question God? And it's almost a misunderstanding of Job, where it's like, well, no, God's saying God can do what God wants to do, and you can't question it. And so you can't have a question of suffering. You can't have a question of goodness or anything like that, because God's sovereign. So just deal with it.
Well, and yet what we see throughout the scriptures is that sovereignty God may be sovereign, right? But how that gets lived out is very different than what is initially intended behind some of that language. So I think it might be helpful to define some terms here, right? You use theodicy. We've talked about God's sovereignty. We're all theology nerds who spent way too much time in seminary classrooms, and so we can kind of understand. But at the same level, let's unpack what this means at a deeper level. The theodicy is the question of, that's just a different name for this question of evil, suffering, and death in our midst, right? Why is there human suffering? Where is God in the midst of that? And sovereignty is an important thing that good and faithful Christians across different traditions disagree on, right? We come to different definitions of that, right? It's the idea that God is all powerful. And for some folks, that also means all controlling, right? That God has pre-planned from the day before time began to now, every step along the way, right? It's the manifestation of everything happens for a reason, right? The unspoken piece of that is, and God set it into motion, therefore don't question it, right? And yet, but when we look at the scriptures, we don't always see that. Every time we wrestle with this, I can't help but go back to the very beginning of the Bible. You know, open page 1, right? Genesis 1, Genesis 3, the two creation narratives side by side, right? We see in the creation of humanity, God creates humanity in God's very own image, right? And then says what? Be fruitful and multiply, take dominion over the earth, right? In that moment, God is saying, I could be in control, but I've created you. I'm trusting you, maybe stupidly, but I'm trusting you, and I am releasing a level of control. I'm choosing. There's a self-limiting action here, right? To not be in control of everything, right? To not puppet master the world, right? And so when suffering comes in our life, right, whether it's a harm caused by somebody in our midst, an illness that is, got its own set of causes, natural disaster or weather event or something like that, that is beyond our control completely, right? When suffering comes, that's not God, dictating from on high, right? The negative thing that's happening in our midst, right? God has kind of created and then set free in many ways, so that we might respond with free love toward God, right? If we're controlled, that isn't love coming back, right? That's manipulated, right? And so when we say everything happens for a reason, right? One, you're right, it is dismissive.
Sure.
And second, it does attribute to God, right, this all-controlling kind of thing, so that every positive and negative thing that has ever happened in the world, has a direct cause, and that direct cause is God. And yet the witness of our scriptures doesn't seem to manifest that, doesn't seem to bear witness to that. As you guys encounter that idea, where do you see ideas like that, or ideas similar to that, or things that kind of connect to that in either your lived experience or in your wrestling with the scriptures?
Yeah, for me, this question seems to be the big question for people outside of the faith as reasons for why God doesn't exist. Well, there's evil and suffering in the world, so if God is all loving and all powerful, then God should do something about our suffering, should remove injustice and suffering from the world with a snap of the fingers. I love a quote that C.S. Lewis had on this, which one of the titans of spiritual thinking and Christian thought. He was wrestling with a terminal cancer diagnosis that his wife had received, and his reflection was that he said, "It's not that I'm in much danger of ceasing to believe in God." He said, "The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about God." He said, "The conclusion that I dread is not, so there's no God after all, but so this is what God is really like." And I think for a lot of people that maybe are outside the church wrestling with suffering, they're thinking, well, if God is all powerful, is this how God is choosing to use God's power? Is this how God is choosing to use God's love? And is that who God really is? Yeah. And if that's who God really is, then I don't want to be any part of it.
Yeah, if God is choosing to inflict hurt, harm, and trouble on people day by day, I mean, it doesn't take much of a view to look around the world and see suffering writ large and evil writ large. I mean, and I don't know, when we're Christian people, especially pastor types talking into microphones about evil in the world, so that can be triggering for folks, right? And yet we live in a world where wars are happening on a couple of different continents right now, right? Yeah. Needless death and hurt and trouble is coming in our midst. We are recording in the aftermath of yet one more mass shooting in our country. To say that evil exists and evil is being lived out in the world is to say simply that hurt, harm, and trouble is coming needlessly to people day in and day out.
I think evil is a byproduct of free will. We are given this, like you said, the dominion. We're given the free will, but sometimes we don't continue in that stream of that love of God. Yeah. And so we veer, we sin, we miss the mark. And that that creates evil, that creates destruction, that creates suffering. So we see that by human intention, but then we can also take a look at the natural disaster side of suffering. We live in organized chaos.
Right.
I mean, there are plate tectonics there, and I'm not a scientist, but there's plate tectonics that move to release the energy.
Yeah.
And we just, as humans, happen to live in those fault lines. And so we see suffering as a byproduct of the organized chaos of the world that we have. And so then we think, well, why does that person experience the natural disaster and I'm over here and fine? I mean, we look at that like tornadoes, right?
Sure.
A tornado will go through a town and spare some houses and then destroy others. I think one of the hardest things to hear is someone in the path that survived is, oh, I'm so blessed. Mm. Well, does that mean that the neighbor who lost their life or their house, are they not blessed?
Yeah.
And again, we try to explain away this suffering and this devastation.
Well, and we struggle to live in the tension there of saying, I am incredibly thankful that no hurt, harm, and trouble came to my house or my people or to my person, right? While also being careful to not talk in such a way that just negates any level of compassion for those who are in the path of the storm, right? Sure. Because the unnamed piece of that is God chose me over you, ha, 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 right? Which, is a bit of a jerk thing to say, right? And a bit of a jerk spirit to embody, but I don't think people intend to embody that spirit, right?
But that ideology even can, if you take that down the road of I'm the chosen one, I mean, look at where that's gotten us as well.
Right.
I mean, that's gotten us to destruction and genocide of people as well. So that can be a scary road to go down theologically.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, the more I have explored in the faith, the more I've grown personally, the more we've all been invited to study and study and study, but also embody faith, the more comes to the surface an attention and awareness to the things that we say that we don't fully examine the unintended consequences of, right? The unintended meanings behind, right? We can end up saying lots of things about God that we wouldn't ever dream of saying directly, but by saying them indirectly, we invite people into a space of question and anger and frustration, right? You've got a book here called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Have Loved by Kate Bowler, right? Why don't you tell us a little bit about the background of that book, where it originated, and kind of some of her exploration in the face of evil, suffering, and death?
So she developed cancer, and that was one of those platitudes that people would say to her, well, everything happens for a reason. And she was a new mother, and she, in her discovery and theological reasoning, is trying to figure out, where is this coming from? She, if I remember correctly, was kind of raised in a more evangelical prosperity gospel type of denomination. And she explores this, and what does that mean when we say that? Those empty platitudes can really be pretty harmful. That's an excellent book for people. And also Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People. His 3-year-old son developed a disease that would in turn take his life when he was a teenager. He is a Jewish rabbi, and he explores the same concept. Thinking like, well, if I'm good, right, then I shouldn't have trouble. And that's not what Jesus promised, right? He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Meaning that it's not the end. Bad things, the evil, the suffering is not the end of the story. And we see that on Easter morning.
It is real, it will happen, but it doesn't get the final word.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
If we've wrestled with kind of what we unintentionally say about God, Dave, what does Scripture say in some very direct ways about who God is and God's character in a way that speaks to this conversation?
Yeah, as Christians, God is just like Jesus for us, and so that's good news for me. At least I appreciate that. And there's many times when people need something from Jesus. Jesus' best friend dies, and he's sick, and his sisters call for Jesus to come, and Jesus doesn't. Like, we're told that he receives word that his friend is sick, and he stays put for a couple days, and then he finally shows up, and Lazarus has died.
And the sisters are angry.
Oh, they're angry. They're like, Jesus,
where have you been?
If you were here, this would not have happened.
Right.
We called for you, and you did not come.
Yeah.
So sometimes we have to wrestle as Christians of like, sometimes we call on Jesus, and Jesus doesn't show up how we want Jesus to show up.
Yeah.
Part of the sovereignty of God, or the sovereignty of Jesus, is that the influence on God is God's will and God's desire for the world. Right. And it's not always ours. Now, I believe that God is compassionate, and God listens, and God is empathetic towards us. And so God hears us. That's one of the beautiful parts of Scripture, is that God hears our cries and responds to them, but just not in the way that we always want God to.
Yeah. God's not the grocery list that we get to sort of.
Yeah, God's not a genie. God's not the grocery list that we get to control and manipulate. God does what God needs to do. And so when Jesus finally shows up, and Mary and Martha are expressing their anger, and they're weeping and they're crying, the response they get from Jesus is not, I will do what I have to do. I will do what I want to do. He doesn't scold them. He doesn't dismiss them. Instead, we're told that he weeps with them.
Yeah.
So one of the realities that we have to wrestle with and realize as Christians were Jesus' words where he tells his disciples, in this world you will have suffering.
Yeah.
But take heart, because I have overcome the world.
Yeah.
Now, those are nice, beautiful words until you're living them.
Sure.
And until you're facing the suffering, and until you have to be reminded that Jesus has overcome the world. I love the book of 1 John and the depiction of God in 1 John as God is love. And I've done enough weddings now to where I know 1 Corinthians 13 and all the attributes of love. And one of the things that strikes me with this is that one of the attributes of love, we love is patient, love is kind, and all, but one of the attributes of love in 1 Corinthians 13 is that love does not insist on its own way.
Yeah.
So if evil and suffering exists in the world, I think we can say pretty firmly, with some confidence, that that's not God's desire for the world.
Right.
God does not desire evil and suffering to exist, but it does. And part of it is because of free will.
Right.
And the love of God and the love that is God does not insist on its own way, but instead allows freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of action. But that doesn't mean that God is unwilling and unable to do anything.
Yeah. Or indifferent to the suffering.
So what does God do in the midst of our suffering?
Yeah.
I think God joins us in the midst of our suffering.
Yeah.
Well, that's what happens when Jesus weeps, right? Again, he didn't scold, he didn't reprimand, he didn't say, could y'all calm down? I can do something now just as easily as I could have done something 3 days ago. You underestimate who I am. No. He experiences the suffering and sits with them in the midst of the suffering. And that's not the only moment we see in the scriptures where Jesus suffers. He comes alongside in suffering again and again and again. As you talked about how God does not insist upon God's own way, right? If God is love and love doesn't insist upon God's own way, part of these conversations that happens again and again is questions about God's plan, right? What is God's plan for our lives and for the world? What is God's plan for humanity, both kind of writ large and individually, right? And so often, I think plan has become a word that has been corrupted's not the right word, but it's so defined outside of how I understand it by kind of the pop religiosity of our day and of our time, that I think we need to be reminded and re-invited to experience the God who intentionally does not insist upon God's own way. And so would we be better to understand in the midst of our own suffering that God hasn't micro-planned every 30 seconds of our life, right? But instead, God has hopes, God has dreams, God has desires for us. God, all three of us are parents, right? We have all held little babies in our arms, not knowing fully what their future holds, but with some hopes, dreams, and desires for them, right? We long for a life better than ours, right? We long for fulfillment. We long for that life that is really life. Are we sounding like Jesus at any point here, right? Jesus said that I come that you might have life and life to the fullest, or a life that is really life, right? That captures, I think, God's spirit for us. And so if we end up unintentionally or intentionally saying something that runs counter to that, I think part of our invitation is to go, hey, wait a minute. right? Or if someone says to us in a moment of suffering, right? Something that seems counter to that, we can hit pause for a second, right? Maybe not in the moment of suffering, but in the reflection afterwards, right? But and wonder, does that really capture the heart and the truth of who I know God to be? While giving ultimate grace for the person offering it to us. Because overwhelmingly, I mean, I think Kate Bowler would even say in the midst of her thing, right? She wrote a whole book saying, and other, everything happens for a reason, and other lies I have loved, right? I mean, she names it as a lie in front of God and everybody in the whole world, right? Puts it in paper and publishes it for the world to see. And yet, I would imagine there's a level of compassion toward those who offered it to her, assuming the right motive, assuming the right intention to offer comfort and care in the midst of a time. It's just unexamined comfort and care in the midst of a time like that.
Yeah. And we all say stupid things. Sure. Right? We all mess up. We all say stupid things, especially when we're not sure what to say. Yeah. I remember my husband and I had a long unexplained infertility journey. And the first miscarriage that we had of several, I would hear, well, your child's in a better place. And it's like, but that's not helpful for me now because we want to be parents. Yeah. And yet I know that I can extend grace in those moments because I know that it's not of harm, even though it may have caused some harm. Right. I can still extend grace to say, I understand where you're going here.
Intentions and outcomes may not be aligned here, right?
Right.
But
yes. But I think education is so important that we need to talk about how we talk about suffering matters, how we talk about death and evil, it matters, that we can have the right language so that when our neighbor experiences difficult times, and I say when, because not if, it's when, we can be there as that loving presence, just like Jesus was.
Right. And suffering and pain to me is amazing that way because I can laugh with anyone, right? Can listen to a comedian and watch a funny. I can laugh with anyone, but I won't cry with everyone. Like there's certain people that are close enough to cry with, and it's usually the ones that I know understand, that I know can sympathize or empathize and have compassion with what we're going through. So that the suffering that we experience, while it's not God's desire and it's not God's plan, it's God can still use it.
Yeah,
sure.
God can still work it for His good.
Yes,
and to connect us with one another, to build those relationships.
Absolutely. Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God and called according to God's purpose. And you're right. Like that suffering, those miscarriages that I had, that's a horrible time, right? And suffering and painful experience full of grief that I don't ever forget. And yet I have been able to walk with other families who have experienced this. There has been good from that because I've been able to offer a level of compassion that some people may not be able to. And, people want to say, oh, I understand how you feel. But if you really don't, those are hollow words where we can use those experiences, when those bad things happen, we can use them for good to say, yeah, I do understand. And that's painful. And I see you and I see that struggle.
And even if I can't understand, right? Because there's parts of that journey that I will never understand,
absolutely.
But I have church members walking through those journeys on a regular basis, right? I can name the truth in honesty. I don't understand, but I am here with you.
Yes,
right?
You're not alone, and God has not left you and will not leave you.
Well, and that's the promise of the psalmist, right? Yeah. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I have nothing to fear. Why? Because you are with me and I am not alone. Yep. That witness, I think, is a huge part of what we're invited into, right? Yeah. And that witness involves some vulnerability and openness to our end, our willingness to sit in and through what can feel awkward, right? Because just as you said, there's only certain people you will cry with. A lot of us, it's a real journey to sit with someone while they cry too, right? We're all good to laugh together. Sometimes we're good to sing together, right? We're all good to boo our favorite team together because inevitably there's disappointment and suffering. We have football fans here. We won't talk about the college football playoff last year. There was suffering for Michigan.
And suffering for
TCU in the aftermath. There was suffering for Baylor. We never made it there. But that reality of we're only willing to let certain people into our suffering, but we also, it's an act of intentionality for us to go sit with somebody else in their suffering too, right? That takes, some people are wired in ways that are helpful in that regard, right? But you don't get there if you don't go on purpose, right?
Yeah, you wonder what that experience that Mary and Martha had with Jesus, how that transformed them. Because you know that wasn't the last time that they grieved or suffered.
Sure.
Yeah.
And what that experience of Jesus literally entering into that space with them, that ministry of presence that we try and practice so much as pastors, how that changed their experience of grief and suffering again. It didn't take it away, right? I firmly believe, and I say this at almost every funeral I participate in, that grief is an expression of love.
Yep.
So when you sign on to love someone, you're eventually signing on to grieve in some form or fashion. And so the grief was still there, but I like to imagine and wonder how that experience of Jesus literally weeping with them changed their experience of grief, but also changed their presence that they had with their friends and their family in the midst of their own grief.
So did that give them courage to then show up at the tomb?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Did
I haven't
that
made that connection.
prepare
That's good.
them
Yeah.
That's
to
good.
be present? Because Jesus was present with them in their suffering, did that give
That's
them
good.
courage
Yeah.
at the tomb?
Yeah. Because they're the ones that went.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, dadgum.
I'll get my Easter sermon now.
Right. Scan that and send it to me.
There you go.
That is powerful, right? And I think that's part of our invitation too. I can remember my first year as a pastor. I was 24 and stupid. Didn't have a clue what I was doing. The poor people of Coolidge, Texas had been sent me because Clifton doesn't know how to say no to stupid people who want to be preachers, right? And early in the midst of that, right? So window into stupidity. 4 weeks after the Super Bowl, we did a 4-week sermon series on Super Bowl commercials and the gospel and how they interconnected.
Okay.
And nobody had watched the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
It was weird.
That's
I mean,
kinda
our
hard
students
to
did because we had a party, but beyond
preach
that,
on.
nobody had, and I wasn't smart enough to go, oh, you've told me you didn't watch this. And so I'm going to insist on verbally describing commercials to you that you have not seen before.
That's good.
Right?
funny.
It was brilliant. Anyway, in the midst of that, we had one of our young adults in the community whose parents and grandparents were in our church die tragically in a motorcycle accident. Just horrendous. Here today, gone tomorrow. Rough, terrible, no good. And after I get the call and I'm going to the house to be with the family, I'm thinking, God, I do not have a clue what I am doing right now. You are going to have to do something. And initially, mine was like, God, give me the words, right? Because we're people of the words. We think we need to have the right thing to say, right? I know enough at 24 to know I don't want to say things that are going to cause harm.
Yeah.
But I got no clue what else to say. And I remember being convicted in the moment. Show up, sit down, and shut up, right? And we sat, and we talked, and they told stories, and we were able to kind of sit with each other in a way. I didn't have any profound wonder today. Nobody said, oh, I'm writing that down for my Easter sermon, right? Nobody stole that moment or anything like that. But the power of presence equipped and empowered me to walk alongside them, not just in that one moment, but for the rest of the time I was with them, right? Trust was built.
Yeah.
And in a way that even the right words wasn't going to build, right? Because there was witness in the midst of that.
And that was all of Jesus's ministry.
Yeah.
That witness, that journeying together.
Can I get a witness?
Yes. That being present, that building trust, the sitting together, just sitting with the women at the well, right? Building the trust, asking questions, having a conversation. So many times, Jesus was there, and that ministry of presence.
Yeah. Well, and a presence and compassion, right? Compassion all the way down to his guts, right? That's the Greek there. Like it's in your guts.
Yes. Deep,
real compassion. As we record this, we named earlier that there is much suffering in the world right now, right? There is war in the Ukraine. There is war in Israel. There is needless death around the world right now. We're in the aftermath of yet another mass shooter in our midst. People are suffering in their own way. The loss of people they loved, illnesses that they can't explain, sitting in moments of hospice where death is just around the corner. For those folks who find themselves in a place of suffering right now, what would you say to them in the midst of that suffering, right? Not, please don't tell them everything happens for a reason. But what would you say to them? And what would you say to those who are trying like crazy to walk alongside them in the midst of this.
I always come back to the words of Jesus saying, peace that I give you, peace be with you, not that the world's trying to give, but that I give. So I would encourage people to stay connected to a communion, a community of faith, a congregation that's going to walk with you through this. Seek out pastoral help. Mental health is a huge thing as well. Yeah. We need to break down the stigma of asking for help with especially mental health concerns and get recommendations for that. I think at the core of my ministry is care. And so I believe that churches need to ramp up their care ministry. It's a huge passion of mine. And I think that we especially now more than ever need to walk and journey with people who are suffering, who are in grief, who are depressed and anxious and sad and overwhelmed. We're not meant to do this life alone. I mean, Jesus and his friends, his buddies, they traveled together. He didn't just go, he went off alone to pray, which was connection with God, which is also what we need in our times of suffering and grief. But we need to be in a community. We need to do this together and journey together.
That's good. I think what's true of Jesus, we want to be true of us individually and collectively as the church. So part of it is just that ministry of presence, creating spaces. I know we have churches in our conference and across our connection that, in the aftermath of localized violence and pain, that they create space and offer prayer vigils and offer, an open sanctuary. And I think that's, I think for people on the outside, that seems like, well, you're not really doing anything. You're just praying. You're just getting together. But so often what we want in those moments is just to not be alone.
Yes.
We want to know that someone's with us no matter what. And I think for the church, that's sometimes the biggest part is just being able to have that presence and to be with folks, to cry with folks and to just be with one another.
In that spirit, I would encourage everybody, again, this is dropping the week of All Saints, right? November 1st is All Saints Day. Some churches are having a special service on a Wednesday evening. Some are including an All Saints Remembrance as a part of their normal Sunday activities in the first Sunday of November. If you have experienced suffering, if you have experienced love or loss in the last year, or are experiencing it in the moment, find that kind of community. Look it up around us. There are thousands of options of places to find it around you. Don't walk this on your own, right? That's the promise of anything, of it all, right? It is not that our life will be perfect and good, but that we don't walk it alone. We walk it with each other, and we walk it with God.
And along those lines, I know we have a lot of churches that are offering Blue Christmases, Blue Christmas services, because sometimes the holidays are the hardest times for folks. And so along those lines, All Saints, Blue Christmas, if you're someone that finds those times difficult, there are communities of faith there for you. And I know that our conference is preparing to get out a list of those churches where you can find those services. So be on the lookout for that.
With resources to follow as well. Follow-up resources. Yep.
Yeah. Very good. Joy, thank you.
Thank you.
Dave, thank you. And thank you for being here with us on Pod Strangely Warmed. I hope and I pray that you have not found all the answers you would have ever hoped to find on the question of evil, suffering, and death, but you found the beginning of a conversation. To engage this conversation more fully, we encourage you to find a pastor type in your community. They want to walk this journey with you. They want to engage these questions with you and let our communities of faith be places where witness happens along the way. And if you need help finding that, comment on this post, email the conference office. Let us be a community of connection that helps you make that connection along the way. Until next time, I'm Daniel Hawkins. Thanks for being with us. This has been Pod Strangely Warmed. If you enjoyed our conversation today, know that you can find us anywhere you find podcasts. On Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, any and all the places, we are there. So if you want to continue the good United Methodist conversation that you've been a part of today, find us, like us, rate us, review us, and share with a friend so that the good news that is happening right here in our own midst can amplify even more.